Welcome to The Sound of Economics, the podcast series by Bruegel, the Brussels-based economic think tank. I'm Giuseppe Porcaro, and today we will discuss about the potential for a transatlantic climate club and the long-standing issue of tariffs that the US has still in place since the Trump administration on steel and aluminum. Guests for today is our visiting fellow David Kleiman, who has just recently written about the issue on a paper which Bruegel has published, and you will find the link in the show notes. Hi David, how are you?
I'm doing great, thanks for having me.
And I'm also happy to welcome from the other side of the Atlantic, well actually on the Pacific side of the United States, Kimberly Closing, who is professor in tax law and policy at the Law School of the University of California, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. During the first part of the Biden administration, Kimberly was the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Tax Analysis in the U.S. Department of the Treasury, serving as the lead economist in the Office of Tax Policy. So I'm really happy to welcome you, Kimberly. And how is it in Los Angeles?
Everything is great on the West Coast, and thank you so much for having me for this conversation.
Thank you. And back to the topic of the conversation. In June 2018, the U.S. Trump administration introduced tariffs on 6.4 billion of European steel and aluminum exports, and further tariffs in January 2020 that affected around 40 million of EU exports on certain derivative steel and aluminum products. The European Union introduced rebalancing measures in June 2018 on US exports to the EU in a value of 2.8 billion. A similar EU response followed the second set of tariff in 2020. The remaining rebalancing measures affecting exports and valued up to 3.6 billion were scheduled to enter into force on 1st of June 2021. But then the EU suspended these measures in order to give space for the parties to work together on a longer-term solution when the Biden administration agreed to settle their dispute. So negotiators from Brussels and Washington are scrambling, and they have until October 2023 to get a deal. At the same time, the discussions have been overlapping with the broader goals of supporting the green transition, and these discussions need to be considered as well against the backdrop of the geopolitical rivalry between the United States and China. With your help, we are going to disentangle these issues, which have both legal, diplomatic, and economic consequences. So first things first, David, can you help us understand where do we stand with negotiations and which is the European Union position specifically?
Thank you so much, Giuseppe. I want to revisit a little bit, what you just said and put it in different words, essentially, to say, indeed, in March 2018, the Trump administration back then imposed these tariffs on steel and aluminum on imports from the EU and pretty much everyone else around the world except Canada and Mexico under the infamous Section 232 US Trade Expansion Act, justifying these tariffs with security concerns. And the EU responded to these really blatantly WTO inconsistent tariffs with rebalancing measures, as you said, under the WTO Safeguards Agreement and with a WTO legal challenge. Now, when the Biden administration took office, everyone around the world somehow hoped that the US would abandon the protectionist path that Trump had charted, lift the 232 tariffs, unblock the appellate body, and do a lot of other things that would support the multilateral trading system or bring it back on track. Which, however, the Biden administration did sadly not do. Instead, once Biden, the USTR Tai and Secretary Raimondo were in office, they decided that they don't want to just abolish those tariffs, but without getting something in return from the EU and others. So in October 2021, the EU and the US negotiated duty-free import quotas based on historical import volumes and suspended the WTO dispute settlement proceedings, which was a first step, I think, in the right direction. But in addition, the US also asked the EU to commit to negotiate a so-called global steel and aluminum arrangement, restoring market-oriented conditions and addressing carbon intensity. That was a demand by the US with a negotiation deadline, as you said, for October of this year. Without an agreement, those US 232 tariffs and the EU rebalancing measures will be reinstalled, which, as we all understand, would be rather awkward. So in October of this year, we have to have some kind of agreement that we can call a global steel and aluminum arrangement. And President von der Leyen and President Biden have reiterated their will to achieve that objective in the joint recent statement in DC on March 10th. So now, where do we stand? We have two working groups. We have one covering restoring market conditions and one covering the carbon intensity part of the equation. And we have two concept notes, one of each side sketching out their ideas and what that arrangement would look like. So far, so good, one could think, until you read those concept notes, which is when it becomes rather clear that USTR wants the EU to become a member of a protectionist steel and aluminum cartel labeled Climate Club that would require the EU to shelve its brand new, well-designed CBAM in respect of steel and aluminum trade transatlantically and install WTO-incompatible steel and aluminum tariffs against the rest of the world. So the EU, on the other hand, seems to propose that the US credibly commits itself through domestic legislative steps to decarbonize its integrated blast furnace steel mills in the Midwest swing states by 2030 and 2040 respectively. At the same time, that proposal would leave each party with the liberty to adopt WTO-consistent market access restrictions and keep the CBAM in place. The EU proposal also includes a number of other desirable commitments, on market distorting industrial subsidies, green procurement, and so on. But overall, what we can see here in the broader picture, I think, is that the EU-US negotiations for these arrangements have become the focal point of competing and really mutually exclusive visions for international climate and trade cooperation, with a US proposal for a coercive exclusive club arrangement and an EU proposal that could be a building block for what we have seen is the inclusive climate alliance, i.e. the G7 climate club setting. So, with these really diametrically opposed initial negotiation proposals from both sides, we have a formidable challenge for October to come to some sort of agreement. And so lunch is served for the negotiators to really come to some sort of agreement that will keep the truce.
Kimberly, from what David sketches out, the US and the EU perspective and the initial negotiation proposals diverge in terms of policy design features and the approach itself. Do you agree with that reading of the current situation? And what is your take on the perspective seen from the United States?
Yes, thank you. And thanks again for having me. I'll start by ultimately agreeing with David in the EU position, actually. But let me say two things which are sympathetic to elements of the US position and at least put their position in context. And then we can talk kind of about the irreconcilable positions of the two. So first, I think one important contextual point is to know that there are just enormous political constraints in the United States that limit what we can do in the steel sector. And if you go back in history, you'll see that the steel sector has benefited from a long list of protection that started well before these 232 tariffs that was justified in any number of ways, including countervailing duties and safeguards and the like. If you look at that sector and its importance, it's not so much that it's important as a key economic sector in the United States, but where those jobs are and where that industry is make it disproportionately important because of its location in the upper Midwest and in these key electoral battleground states. And if you set this in the context of the inroads the former President Trump made with certain types of voters that were non-college educated and were in these kinds of jobs, right? The salience of this sector to the current administration is, very large. So I don't think it's going to be particularly easy to sort of just go with like a free trade approach in this sector for the United States, right? And that's largely for political reasons. A second thing that we should note about the U.S. approach is that it does make sense for policy instruments to vary with respect to climate change, right? So the United States has gone with the subsidization approach. That is what they were able to do at the time, in part because of political constraints. Not every country can do an approach that is perfectly well aligned with what the EU is doing. I do think the EU approach is superior in many respects, but that doesn't mean that every country can do it. So we do kind of want to look at solutions that recognize that there are going to be diverse approaches to handling climate change mitigation, but we also maybe don't want to take that lesson too far. Like, we want to enable over time greater alignment. And I think there are reasons to think that the US could over time become more aligned. The fiscal picture will change, the political picture will change, times change, so it's possible that the US could move closer to where the EU is at present. But I do think at this point, right, that leaves these two jurisdictions in a very oppositional frame with respect to the steel and aluminum agreement. And I'm very sympathetic to the EU position in several respects. I think it's very important to uphold the general rules of the world trading system. I think it's untenable to have a club between the European Union, which has this very well-designed CBAM, and a country that isn't imposing costs on its industry at all. It wouldn't make sense for the US to levy tariffs on other countries based on, costs that it's not imposing on its own industry. And so when you look at that starting point, it's, unsurprising that these two jurisdictions are so far apart. And I also think that regardless of what happens ultimately with this agreement, one needs to recognize that this industry itself is just a very bad model for other industries, right? Because of this long history of protectionism, because of its key political constraints. I think the absolute worst outcome we could get is to say that steel is a good model for how we should handle carbon-intensive industries writ large, or trade writ large, or redesign of the trade rules writ large. I think we're always going to have to recognize that steel is somewhat exceptional and deal with it in a somewhat separate way.
Thank you, Kimberly. I would like to ask a first reaction from David's side about what you just told us, and extremely interesting, explaining the background of the US position, and of course that it's much more complex and domestic than we might perceive from an external point of view sometimes.
Yes, indeed. I thank you, Giuseppe, and I fully agree with Kimberly that the root of the problem is really the political economy of the U.S. steel industry, with the integrated steel mills in the Midwestern swing states, for which the U.S. currently does not have a decarbonization path. There's no roadmap. There's no legislative proposals. There seems to be a lack of ideas what to do about them, because if you disrupt the employment there and the production as it currently stands there, it's politically extremely explosive. So there is certainly a lot of sympathy on this side for the political conundrum that the U.S. finds itself in at the moment. At the same time, what the U.S. negotiators are trying to do here is really, they're trying to kill three birds with one stone, and that is to do something to protect the steel industry, the blast furnaces in the Midwestern swing states from competition. At the same time, do something about carbon intensity. Portray yourself as a leader in climate change mitigation and carbon abatement, and at the same time, do something that is popular against China. And so the result of this is, unfortunately, a misguided proposal that would be ineffective in actually decarbonizing the domestic steel industry, would be less effective than other policy designs, as in the EU, for instance, to decarbonize or to incentivize the decarbonization of steel and other industries in third countries. And as regards China, there's very different political opinions about that. But it's the problem really here is that if you try to do too many things with one policy instrument, you're probably not going to achieve the outcomes that you aspire for. And this is something that the EU also needs to protect itself from. And we need to make sure that, this sort of the protectionist sentiment coming from the US in that sector in particular doesn't spill over to the policy design in the European Union.
David, indeed. I think that one of the main challenges that have floated already in the conversation is the different approach that we have on the overall transition. Todd Tucker at the Roosevelt Institute and Timothy Meyer of the Vanderbilt University, if I pronounce it correctly, they've been arguing that the United States doesn't need to go down the path of the same path of the EU and have carbon pricing. And it seems to me that this different approach, which Kimberly also has mentioned, about the fact that the US is working to reach sectorial agreements and agree on how to measure carbon intensity, it's a completely different approach than the one that the EU has with the ETS system and with the CBAM and so forth. Maybe it will be worth to explain to our listeners this frame, because I think that this will be key to understand why there is such a divergence into the steel story and also some other stories that are connected to this.
Right. So Todd and Tim have, commendably, made an attempt to solve the political conundrum that the US is finding itself in with regard to steel. They observed that the US steel industry, on average, is the most carbon competitive in the world, and said, well, we should use this, our carbon advantage in the steel industry, and basically externalize the Trump tariffs to the customs borders of the European Union and others, and call them carbon tariffs instead of national security tariffs. Under Trump, not so popular. So they came up with this idea of having a transatlantic common external tariff for steel and aluminum imports, which of course would have to replace the EU CBAM, which is based on a domestic carbon price, a carbon price that the United States doesn't have. So they said, well, we can just convert, the domestic regulatory adaptation costs that companies face into a tariff and then justify this as a border adjustment, as the same what the European Union is doing with its domestic carbon price. There's huge problems with converting non-pricing policies like regulation, emission regulation, into tariffs or a border carbon tariff. Those, has to do with the fact that producers have different abatement cost curves. So you would overprotect some, underprotect others. So those incentives that you said would be really inefficient and ineffective in sort of incentivizing third country producers to actually decarbonize. Then this scheme would also not, credit carbon prices paid in third countries. It would, use countrywide average carbon intensity benchmarks, which means that a producer from a high emission country who's actually doing pretty well in terms of carbon intensity production doesn't really have an incentive to further abate, but is just reliant on the average carbon intensity of production in its country. So, overall, those are really not first-rate, state-of-the-art design features, and I could go on. So we are lagging a bit behind in the US in thinking about how we can, incentivize domestic abatement and external or third country abatement. But in the end of the day, we really need to face the facts that the name of the game is national industrial decarbonization. We cannot distract ourselves from the domestic challenge of decarbonizing our industries by proclaiming that we just impose tariffs at the border, and with that we are doing something about decarbonization in third countries. No, we have to look at our own industries and tighten the screws there.
Thank you, David. And I'm looking at Kimberly to both ask for a comment on this very important issue of the overall approach, and also to ask the $1 million question. Despite this different approach, you see prospect for actually finding an agreement in the end of the day on this steel and aluminum issue.
Yes. So let me just agree with a lot of what David said. I think that this approach is fundamentally flawed for a host of reasons, right? U.S. policy in the steel industry is not a good model to try to build on. And this idea of putting a common tariff on third countries is extremely flawed given the different starting points of Europe and the United States. But I think actually the most dangerous thing about this proposal is that it might unravel some of the really exceptionally good work that Europe has done in coming up with a very rules-based, non-discriminatory carbon border adjustment mechanism. And that work is really important. It's important in that it could inspire other countries to also pursue a similar approach. And if it's done well in a non-discriminatory fashion, it can do that without tearing down the world trading system. And rather, it can actually support the world trading system and lead to productive policy change in other countries. So I think it's, regardless of what happens with the steel and aluminum sector, I think it's extremely important for the European Union to be able to defend their approach and to keep their approach consistent with long agreed upon principles of a rules-based trading system, and particularly the non-discriminatory feature. So I'm not really optimistic that, given this large difference of starting points between the United States and Europe, that there's going to be a magic solution here. But I think the best solution would avoid weakening what the European Union is trying to do. And I do think giving industry tariffs without imposing domestic costs is not a good model for either this industry or for any industry, because effectively you're telling the domestic industry that they can have the protection for free, right? Like you're kind of catering to their worst instincts without getting any emissions reduction in return. And as David points out, emissions reduction is the North Star here. We want to address climate change, then we really need to do things that are effective in that regard.
So a little bit of a bleak picture over there, I have to say. Unfortunately, it doesn't help to be optimistic. However, and Kimberly, I'm looking at you again. However, do you think that there are areas where cooperation could go on a more promising direction?
Yeah, I think there are several, actually. And I think maybe a starting point is to take a step back from steel and aluminum and take a moment to applaud some of the good things that have happened lately. I do think the Inflation Reduction Act as a whole is a productive step forward in a couple of ways. It shows that the United States is really taking climate change seriously. It will help reduce emissions in the United States, and it will hopefully also help fuel innovation and movement down the cost curves in these important green technology industries that can benefit the entire world. So that part, I think, we can applaud, even though that there are aspects of that legislation that are, of course, flawed. And, I'm thinking of the domestic content provisions, but there's still overall a positive coming out of that legislation that I think we should focus on. I also think that there are reasons to, in the future, hope for, improvements, right? The United States can take some care both in the implementation of that legislation to try to avoid some of the harmful spillovers that can happen to other countries. But they can also kind of work towards, in the medium run, productive steps to better align their policies with what other countries are doing. And I think we're going to have some opportunities in the coming years, in 2025, for instance, when the U.S. tax code is going to open up again anyway, because of the expiration of a bunch of tax cuts that Trump put in place in the 2018. A lot of those tax cuts expire, which means we're going to have to kind of revisit new sources of revenue. And that might be a moment where the U.S. could pivot towards an approach that looked a little bit more like the European approach. So I think we should be open about those kinds of possibilities down the future. A second area where we could have better cooperation is, I think the United States should work with partners throughout the world, not just the European Union, but also China and others, on better frameworks for handling these kinds of trade-related climate issues. And I have some work forthcoming with Chad Bown at the Peterson Institute, where we talk about some tweaks to trade rules that could help reduce these types of conflicts in the future. So for instance, I think part of what causes this urge to subsidize and this urge to do discriminatory trade policies is concern that other countries might weaponize trade, right? So if you can handle simultaneously concerns about export restrictions, like what if we don't have access to lithium? What if we don't have access to this or that key good? If you can pair those kinds of concerns with better rules on subsidies and with green lighting, certain types of CBAMs like the EU non-discriminatory CBAM, while also cautioning about discriminatory CBAMs. I think you could get a package of reforms that could work for a lot of the key big jurisdictions in this area and use that as a stepping stone towards eventual WTO reform. And I spell that out more with Chad in a different work, but I think that would be helpful. Finally, I think that there are actually some real opportunities at present to kind of already exploit some ways in which the US and Europe are more aligned. So I'm thinking of methane here. If you look at the recent Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, it includes a price-based measure on methane emissions as a backstop for regulatory strengthening. So that there's an improvement in the US regulations around methane that should involve more leak detection and repair, better equipment, and other types of measures that would dramatically, hopefully, reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. And the US is probably the largest emitter, not in terms of intensity, but in terms of bulk methane emissions in oil and gas sector. So this is a big improvement for the United States, but it's also backed by a price. At the same time, Europe also has been looking at much improved methane regulations, and these are, part of the trilogue process presently, where they're taking similar regulatory steps as they're taking in the United States. So you could sort of take these two together and say, listen, we could even go line by line and try to make these even more harmonized, but they're already quite aligned already. And you could imagine that the two jurisdictions working together to sort of, as a model for the rest of the world, say, listen, we think these regulations are the ones to have. If you want to sell into Europe or the United States oil or natural gas, you also have to implement similarly equivalent regulations or face a fee, just like the Inflation Reduction Act does to US producers. So it's basically treating all countries the same, as the U.S. treats its own producers under the Inflation Reduction Act, and saying, like, either clean up by these regulations or face a fee. Now, you might worry that, well, that's untenable for the poor countries of the world. But one of the great things about this area is there's just an enormous ability to undertake low and even negative cost mitigation, right? So you can imagine with a period of implementation of 2 to 3 to 4 years, you could basically provide the sorts of technical assistance and capacity building required so that other countries could also implement these kinds of regulations at a very, very low or potentially even negative cost. And this could have an enormous consequence for global emissions, because methane emissions from oil and gas are about 3 to 7% of all greenhouse gas emissions worldwide. So if you reduce this even by 50% as a result of these policies, that would be as effective as all of the emissions reductions in the Inflation Reduction Act. But one reason we suggested this beyond the emissions reduction effects, and there's a new policy brief out by myself and Catherine Wolfram and Luis Garicano that makes this case, but it is that this opportunity would also be an opportunity to better align policy approaches between these key players, to say, like, listen, this is a chance for us to work together in a collaborative fashion to pursue a more aligned approach. And maybe we could learn from that collaboration and build on it in ways that would ultimately bring the US, Europe, and other people together more closer to what the Europeans are already doing with carbon, right? But start with methane, because we already have a price. We don't need, policy action in the United States aside from implementation, and we can work with other countries to kind of build up the cooperation muscles that way.
Thank you, Kimberly. And I would like to ask a reaction also to this proposal about methane. David, please.
Yeah, thank you so much, both. Well, first of all, I think one of the extremely commendable things about the IRA is really, the methane tax. That is really the first emission tax that the US has actually installed, and is a first price on an emission domestically, which is a small step forward, as in, towards potentially a price on carbon in the future. We love to see that, and that's fantastic. I would just like to circle back for a moment on something that you said about, sort of the bleak picture that we're seeing in transatlantic cooperation. on a joint approach to carbon pricing or carbon tariffs and so on. I think, all of these initiatives need to be seen really as a technical cooperation exercise. It's really about learning from each other, sharing information, understanding and adopting best practices. And that can absolutely happen with regard to methane. It doesn't have to happen as a hard legal sort of club form integration format. These corporations can happen relatively loosely. It doesn't have to become sort of a deep integration framework. But cooperation in those areas is, of course, extremely commendable. Another area of cooperation that Kim already just mentioned is environmental subsidies, I think, where we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of what are the first best subsidies, what are the second best, and what are really the ones that we don't want to see rich countries adopting. Because indeed, it creates disparity with the global south. If we have those local content requirements, if we have those domestic production subsidies that are luring investments away from third countries that may have a comparative advantage in producing those clean tech goods. And that is something I think that we should intensify a transatlantic dialogue on, as well as in the area. And here again, just to circle back for a second on this steel and aluminum somehow tainted exercise. What this should be used for, on the bright side, is understanding how, for instance, as a first step, we can best account for carbon. Find common methodologies for carbon intensity calculation, for having similar standards for clean steel, aluminum, and other industrial products. This is the hard work that needs to be done, and that needs to be done throughout the world, finding common approaches to this with the input of the international organizations and their members and their intelligence is, I think, an absolutely desirable objective. And this is really where the US and the EU should lead. But that is the hard technical work, and that needs to be accomplished. And I think the US and the EU are well positioned to provide leadership here.
Thank you, David. And unfortunately, we don't have so much more time for this episode. I would have liked really to discuss much more, because the issues that are related to this are really humongous, and they are critical both on the relations between the green transitions and industrial policy, but then also in relations to transatlantic relations, but also domestically in the US, and then also within the geopolitical frame that we are running on. So, we could spend hours and hours on this, but unfortunately, that's all the time we have for that episode today. But I'm pretty sure that we're coming back to this, David and Kimberly, perhaps even involving both of you in some other conversations later on during the next episode. So thank you so much to both of you. And I would like to remind our listeners that the paper by David is available on our website, and the link to the paper is in the show notes, and that, as usual, you can read in open access all the analysis by our scholars on our website, www.bruegel.org. So Kimberly, David, thanks a lot, and thanks to our listeners for following us. Until next time, bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.